What do you mean killing the protagonist's mentor at the midpoint didn't work?
Oh, bugger, he's here. I'll call him back.
Azeroth the Eviscerator, it's time to pay for your crimes.
Oh, Mr. Protagonist, I fear you misunderstand me.
Misunderstand? You do know you killed 1 million people, right?
What is that? Why is there sad music playing?
It all began one day when I lost my parents in a tragic evisceration incident. Ever since that day, I have vowed that no child will ever be orphaned again. For you see, I am the hero of my own story. If you really cared about the children, I don't think you'd have burned down that orphanage.
A mere manifestation of my childhood trauma, I assure you. For you see, I burned down that orphanage for sympathetic reasons. The staff in that place abused me most maliciously, they did, inflicting upon me the most cruel punishments.
Why burn down a building filled with children when you cared about them so much?
Ah, I see, Mr. Protagonist. No. You see, I'm not written for consistency. No. The writer believes that pure evil villains are bad in every circumstance, so ham-fisted in a sad backstory in an attempt to give me more nuance than the narrative really required of me.
Enough talk. You killed my mother.
Oh, don't get me started on my mother, for you see, she abused me most maliciously, she did, inflicting upon me the... Ow, stop, that really hurt! Stop, ow!
Evil villains are fantastic. All the time people force in a sympathetic motivation in the hope of making the villain more complex. But a lot of the time, man, like someone of pure evil incarnate would be the better choice. I can't help but think of Jack Horner in Puss in Boots 2.
You're not gonna shoot a puppy, are you, Jack?
Yeah, in the face. Why?
Basically, everyone loved watching him, not despite the fact he was pure evil, but because of it. It's so fresh to have a story these days go against the trend of making every villain sympathetic. Sometimes evil just works. But why? And how do you decide whether or not your villain is oozing with nuance and sympathy, or simply an irredeemable monster? That is a surprisingly tricky question. A great place to start is Lord of the Rings. It doesn't just have the original Dark Lord that kicked off not just that fancy trope, it kicked off all of modern fantasy. It also goes for an approach to pure evil that works really quite effectively. We have Sauron, the Dark Lord, exist purely in the background. While we hear about his deeds and plans, seeing his armies do their thing, we never get a close-up glimpse of him. Imagine for a second if we were given 5 cutaway scenes to Sauron as he tells us his sympathetic backstory, how he was bullied by the other wizards in the playground. If we had gotten such scenes, they would have been awful, because they would have been ham-fisted in, or to put it a bit more technically, they would have been wholly irrelevant to the story. In Lord of the Rings, Sauron is uncomplicated, pure evil, but that honestly works, because he is not really a character, he is more so a force of nature. In the books, he has about 4 lines of dialogue when he speaks to Pippin through the Palantir, and that is it. It's actually crazy how little page time Sauron got in that trilogy, but that's fine, because he has the exact same narrative function as the comet does in Armageddon or the aliens do in Independence Day. The story is not about him, it's about the protagonists working to overcome him. If Tolkien had made Sauron all complex and sympathetic, that wouldn't have done anything to make the quest to destroy the One Ring any more fun for the reader. For a fact, it would have made the story less focused and took up a bunch of time better spent on Frodo and the crew, seeing as they're the ones the story is really about. There is a benefit to having simple characterization like this, playing into archetypes like the wise mentor or the evil overlord, because you don't need to spend much time with them for the audience to understand exactly what they are and the role they serve in the story. If you're doing short fiction, playing into the Dark Lord trope might just work fantastically for you, because you need only to convey that trope is being used, and the audience now has a clear understanding of who this character is and that he has some nebulous goal of world domination. domination and almighty wizard-like power. Playing into archetypes like this and exploiting an audience's preconceived notions of everything around a certain trope can make your story much leaner, as you now need to give far less setup and exposition. But you know what? You can have a wholly evil character take center stage, have a ton of screen time, yet work fantastically. Let's go back to Jack Horner. It was rather fun to see an unapologetically evil villain. The movie actively mocks the idea of having a sympathetic backstory.
You know, I never had much as a kid. Just loving parents, and stability in a mansion, and a thriving baked goods enterprise for me to inherit.
More or less saying, Jack doesn't have a sympathetic backstory. He's actually lived a very nice life. It just so happens he is irredeemably evil by nature.
You're an irredeemable monster!
What took you so long, idiot?
Now, with Jack Horner, you can point at how he's playing into one of those universal things that makes for great evil villains. He's charismatic and is having so much fun. Another example that comes to mind is Claw from Black Panther. He's having so much fun in all of his evil deeds that we can't help but have fun alongside him. Now, I have seen lots of people say this about Jack Horner, and while I think that's true, I also think that we can go a lot deeper here. What works really well for Jack is how he plays into the theme, that of learning to be grateful for what you have. In the start of the film, Puss in Boots, Goldilocks and Jack Horner all feel no gratitude for what they have, but as the film goes along, Goldilocks and Puss in Boots have their arcs and learned their lesson here. Meanwhile, Jack is static. He never has a hint of being redeemed, meaning, in the end, his death is actually really quite cathartic because it's a lovely way to tie off the themes of the story. It validates the journey Puss in Boots and Goldilocks have gone on because we see in Jack Horner what would have happened to them had they failed to learn their lesson of appreciating what they already had. Now, Jack Horner works fantastically, but I think another super powerful way to approach making evil villains work is when they're allegorical for larger ideas. This can be highly effective if done right. As a great example, take a look at Peter Pan and Captain Hook. Peter himself lives in Neverland, a place where he will not age and can be a child forever. He has totally rejected the prospect of growing up, for it's far too scary for him. Hook, meanwhile, serves a really interesting function. He is Peter's negative role model. Instead of being a traditional role model, when Peter looks up to Hook, he sees a man he needs to do anything but emulate. The man is bitter, tyrannical, and has totally lost his sense of fun. Hook's mere existence facilitates the lie Peter believes, as he is the manifestation of every unconscious reason why Peter wants to remain a child forever. What's really fun is when you look at Hook, he is terrified of the crocodile, a crocodile where whenever he gets near, he's accompanied by the sound of a clock. Here's a question: why would a crocodile always emit a ticking noise? That is such an odd detail to include. In the end of the classic film, Hook even leaps into the croc's belly and comes out holding the clock, which is now ringing. What could possess the original writers to include that detail? Well, it's because this right here is another symbol. The crocodile represents death, the ticking represents time, and the two combined represent the impending inevitability of death as it closes in on Hook. Maybe it won't get him today, maybe not tomorrow, but it will someday. Captain Hook, as an adult, is constantly under the threat of death. It's something he's terrified of and is grappling with constantly. Meanwhile, for Peter, a perpetual child, when he hears the crocodile, he reacts like this.
Say, Captain, do you hear something?
Death doesn't bother him because he's a kid, and the idea of his own mortality, it's something he has yet to grapple with. He finds it terribly fun as the crocodile comes and Hook runs in fear of it, oblivious to the fact that one day it will come for him too. To a degree, to learn to embrace the inevitability of death is to become an adult. You can't grow up until you've embraced this fact. Of course, Peter wants to remain a kid, because why would he want to end up like Hook, a neurotic, hateful man who does not enjoy life, living in terror of the crocodile that will one day surely eat him? In the classic story, Hook works fantastically as a villain, not in spite of him being a purely negative character, but because of it. Of course, the conclusion the themes kind of inevitably lean towards here is that the key is synthesis. You do not want to be like Hook, obviously, but you also don't want to be like Peter. You want to be both. This is why I love the film Hook so much, because in the beginning, Peter has become Captain Hook, effectively, an adult who has totally lost touch with his inner child, with no sense of fun.
Everybody just shut up!
Sorry.
But Peter learns his lesson, attuning with his inner child, and in the end, he goes back to the real world as this new version of himself, as he's embraced his inner Peter Pan, much to the joy of his family. It makes for a wonderful arc. It is so rare to see an adaptation that takes so much creative liberty, yet also totally gets the core themes of the original and expands upon them in respectful, powerful ways. Captain Hook is pitch perfect for the themes the original was exploring. So pitch perfect, Hook, a film which is criminally underrated, saw no need to reimagine him whatsoever, because how can you improve upon perfection? So, what I find really interesting is looking at the recent live-action remake of Peter Pan and how they totally screwed this up. Because, you guessed it, Hook is now a sympathetic villain, where he has a really tragic backstory, and the writers tried really hard to get us to sympathise with his motivation of hunting down and killing a group of children. What peeves me here is how the writers of this remake weren't clueless. They understood the intentions of the original and tried to keep the allegories and themes intact. Hook even says in one scene to Wendy about himself,
"This is what growing up looks like."
But while they tried to respect the original, they did a miserable job at actually achieving that. Why? Well, in the new film, Hook was once a lost boy along with Peter. In fact, he was Peter's best friend. But then, one day, Hook voiced that he missed his mum, and from that, Peter threw a tantrum and banished him from Neverland, not sending him back to his mum, rather leaving him abandoned in the middle of the ocean. Because of this, Hook has now grown up, and his motivation in the story is to get revenge on Peter for his betrayal. Now, does this make Hook more sympathetic? Sure, it absolutely does. Being betrayed sucks after all. But here is the crucial question. What does Hook's new sympathetic motivation of revenge for being so horribly betrayed by his best friend do to bolster that original theme of his character? The answer? Nothing, not that I can see. Holding grudges is not exclusive to adults, kids do it all the time. This addition does nothing to bolster that original allegory, making said allegory really start to fall apart here. They committed a cardinal sin of writing here, and that was seeing elements of their story in isolation, failing to consider the larger scheme of things. Too many writers fall for this trap right here of throwing in an element that they like making their villain highly sympathetic, because they think, ooh, I like this thing. I want this cool thing in my story. Yet they give no thought to how well that element complements the other parts of the story, the theme, the protagonist's journey, and so on. A story is like a machine. Never think in terms of how cool can I make my villain, this individual cog, be. Instead think in terms of how can I make the relationship between this cog and the other cogs as cool as it can be. The more you think in these terms, the leaner your story becomes, the more each part works in harmony with the other parts, and I'd certainly argue the better your story is in the end. You can have a sympathetic villain, absolutely. You can also have a pure evil, mustache-twirling bastard. Both can work, but neither is ubiquitously the right choice. Now, as a caveat to the idea of making pure evil villains allegorical, you want to tread carefully here because it can go horribly wrong. Someone consulted me a while back asking for feedback on a story, and I'm changing basically every detail apart from the ones that matter so no one can recognise it, but the theme of that story was abortion. Is it good or bad? Which is a very contentious theme to cover, but it's also quite a rich one, and it could make for a very interesting story if properly explored. This person made a great choice in having one character take one stance on the theme of no, it should never be done, and the other main character had the opposite stance on the theme of yes, it is a wonderful idea, let's do it all the time. This made them them both proxies for one side of the debate, enabling a full exploration of the idea. Everything they had on paper, in theory, was fantastic. The problem lied in, and yes, I'm sure most of you can tell where this one's going, because she made the person who was pro-choice a pure evil villain. They made the person advocating for choice a murderous, sociopathic maniac who manipulated everyone she came across, and clearly the writer was trying their very hardest to make you hate this person. The problem is, this is called strawmanning. It's when you have a bias as a writer, so you ennoble the sides of arguments that you personally agree with, only focusing on the good of those things, then demonize the sides of things that you disagree with, only focusing on the negatives of those things. As a result, you are giving a dishonest exploration of the topic, failing to resonate with the truth of things, meaning your stories will not be impactful for it. As a counterexample, look at Magneto. He is one of the best villains in all of comics, if you ask me, yet he's also highly sympathetic, having been a victim of humanity at our very worst. But he's embodying a larger idea, the opposite of what Xavier is, making them perfect foils for each other. They both want the same thing, peace and security for all mutant kind. Xavier just believes this can only be achieved through peaceful cooperation with humans. Eric, meanwhile, believes this can only be achieved through domination over humans. The obvious parallel is Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. These two characters are representing both sides of this universal topic. If you are part of a subjugated group, how do you go about fighting for your rights? Do you seek domination over your oppressors, or do you seek peaceful cooperation? It would be sinful to turn Magneto into a psychopathic madman who laughs maniacally as he slaughters civilians, while having Charles be this benevolent, lovely man. If you did that, you'd be strawmanning one side of the debate, and so your story would fall flat because of it. Admittedly, Magneto is an evil guy and he does kill people, while Xavier is significantly nicer than Eric, but their actions are still largely attuned to what someone of their stances on this theme would actually do. Magneto is interestingly not a hate-filled man. He only kills people when they get in the way of his larger motivation of securing the future of his people. It just so happens that most of the time that involves killing the humans because they're in the way of that goal. The truth is, allegorical villains are a double-edged sword. They can work fantastically. They can also backfire horribly. As a catch-all litmus test to make sure that you don't stumble here, I'd say that you need to ask what best represents the way the real world is. How best can you capture the truth of things? Maybe that involves a complex, sympathetic villain like Magneto, or it involves a dastardly bastard like Jack Horner. How villains play into the theme really needs to be tailored on a story-to-story basis. Just make sure that you never misrepresent the truth of any matter in your story. But here is my biggest pet peeve with writers out there. Many believe that pure evil villains are generic, that they just want more power, or perhaps to have a nice coat by skinning some puppies. And so if we follow them for too long, such paper-thin characters will quickly bore us. It is because of this belief that many writers will make the villain sympathetic because they believe if you want to make your villain a complex one, they must be sympathetic or they will lack depth. If you ask me, this is total bollocks, because if you have a character who is terribly evil, purely so, that does not mean they have to be simple. Look at Homelander. He is one of the best written villains we've seen in recent times. I did a whole video a while back analysing him, which you can check out by clicking that thing in the top right corner, but despite the fact he is pure evil, he has a very complex pathology going on. He is a narcissistic sociopath who craves admiration and power. These two desires of his conflict all the time, where he has to control his urge to murder people or he will lose his admiration from his adoring public. These conflicting motivations of his create some very powerful tension where we never quite know which will win out, making him highly unpredictable. And ever since he started hanging out with his son, it's been really interesting to see how such an evil man goes about raising a kid and slowly corrupts him as time goes on. While Homelander is irredeemably evil, he is plenty complex enough that he is still electrifying to see on screen, scene after scene. Honestly, getting an accurate depiction of narcissism like this in a superhero makes for a fascinating character if you ask me. There's an ironic dissonance to be found because superheroes are meant to be selfless, but Homelander is purely selfish. A fair few people have said The Boys has started to get a bit boring these past few seasons, and honestly, I kind of get it actually, but I don't think that's got anything to do with Homelander not being complex enough. It's rather because of a larger plot-based issue of how they've been failing to give us this feeling of progression on the large scale. Furthering this point, let's say you wrote a story about a dictator in the style of a certain one from the 1940s, whose name I cannot say or I will be demonetized. So I'm going to call him Mr. H from now on. If you wrote a story following him and you truly nailed it, where you properly depicted what such despots are like, that sounds like a character who is oddly fascinating to follow. In such a case, you would have a character of pure evil, but the idea of following Mr. H do as he does, as the viewer comes to understand his mind as they glimpse all of the chilling, subtle, bizarre nuances of how such a depraved man thinks, that sounds like a fascinating character many people would find oddly engrossing. One of my favourite foreign language films is Look Who's Back, and the premise is that Mr. H is magically transported from the 1940s into the modern day. Mr. H is the main character of that film. Of course, he is deeply hateable, but my god, the film touches on some fascinating ideas. Namely, that the evil back then did not stem from this one man, it stemmed from the people. Mr. H just so happened to be very good at galvanizing the people and riling up the monster within them. And as Mr. H gains followers in the current day, riling up the masses, entering the realm of German politics to great success, it makes you realize the depressing truth that the evil from way back then was not unique to that era. It exists right now, and all it takes is the right man, the right political environment, and it might just happen all over again. Look Who's Back shined a light on a depressingly insightful thing that I had never imagined before watching it, and it did so with a pure evil villain as the main character. Anyone who pretends that pure evil makes for inherently unnuanced, uncompelling stories is kidding themselves. But more than theme and complexity of character, there's another angle to this topic. Whether or not you have a pure evil villain should depend on your protagonist too. Again, don't consider elements in isolation, consider how to make them gel well with each other. Let's say you have someone like Sherlock Holmes, a genius, but he's also selfless. He uses his incredible intellect for good. I am talking about the original novels here, not the sociopathic version we've gotten in so many modern adaptations. Well, for a man like this, he needs a foil, a man who is his opposite. So now we have Moriarty, a genius, yet he's also selfish, and uses his incredible intellect for personal gain. These two men are taking two extreme stances on the idea of if you have incredible competence in an area, do you use your skills purely in your own interest or purely in the interest of others? This creates a fun dynamic between them that allows itself for endless reimagining. I've got no doubt that in 50 years, people will still be telling stories between these two characters. But then this idea gets a little more nuanced when you look at characters like Joker and Batman. Again, we have a pure evil villain, an agent of chaos, versus a man of pure good, an agent of order. But crucially, the Joker isn't just a great villain for Batman because he's his opposite, he's fantastic because Batman believes he should never take a life. Not ever. But Joker presents the ultimate test of that rule because he is the worst possible kind of human. If Batman were to ever break his no-killing rule, it would be for the Joker, a man of pure evil. This is yet another reason why Snyder's Batman pisses me off somewhat, because if Batman did break bad, why was his first move not to come up behind Jared Leto's Joker and snap his stupid neck? To all you Snyder Batman fans out there, how the hell is the Joker alive in a universe where Batman has abandoned his no-killing rule? I'm just saying, those people did not understand his character whatsoever. But you know what? It's true what they say. A hero is only as good as his villain, because every time Batman interacts with the Joker, it is the ultimate test of his moral integrity. To the people saying sympathetic villains are always better, here is a slam dunk answer proving them wrong. Because imagine if the Joker were sympathetic, if he had a really tragic backstory, and he has a daughter dying of cancer, and he's only robbing banks because he needs the money to pay for her treatment costs. Oh my god, that is a terrible idea. It would ruin this wonderful dynamic these two characters have going on, because that reduces the motivation Batman might feel to murder him, meaning the Joker presents less of a challenge to Batman's character, making him a worse foil for it. I'd even go out and say that while Joaquin Phoenix's Joker was an interesting take on the character, going for the sympathetic route with him, which did work quite well as a standalone story, I can't help but feel that if he went toe-to-toe with Batman, I just don't think he'd be as good a foil as the other versions of Joker, due to him having that sympathetic touch to him. The truth is, pure evil villains can work fantastically, but you should never throw one into your story just because you think they're cool. You've got to think about how they play into the themes, or how well they work as a foil for your protagonist. All too often, those two issues are surprisingly closely linked. Consider the Lord of the Rings approach of making them this purely background force, or the Puss in Boots one of giving them the exact same flaw as the protagonist, making their downfall caused by this flaw all the sweeter because it validates the protagonist's arc. Or take the Joker approach of asking first and foremost, how can I get my villain to challenge my protagonist as much as possible? Whether they be pure evil or sympathetic should really be an afterthought. And if you need help in writing villains, I made a Skillshare course a few years back all about how to write great characters, and I cover making great villains pretty extensively in that course. I talk all about building characters from the ground up so that they compel your audience as much as possible, and if you like, you can check it out right now. All you gotta do is click my link in the description and be one of the first 1,000 people to get a 1-month free trial using my link. There are only so many spots available. I couldn't recommend Skillshare enough to you. While it is today's sponsor, I've been using it on and off for 5 years now because there are some really great writing courses on there. It's a fantastic place to pick up new skills and hone your craft. And once you're done with my course, you can check out the Writer's Toolkit by Simon Van Boy. He gives out a lot of useful advice on that one, not about character, but about how to build the best habits possible as a writer. And it's a course I found really quite interesting. Again, if you're interested, do click my link in the description and be one of the first 1,000 people to grab a 1-month free trial for Skillshare. Grab your slot now before they go. Anyway, do like this video if you found it useful, keep writing, and I'll see you guys next time on The Closer Look.